Chapter 361, A Battle for General 2. 4 seconds. Silas was counting the seconds in his mind, but he had already noticed that General Aileen's armor was highly resistant to his poison. Before, he should have lost 50 health every second, but instead, he had only lost 10. Still, the fact that he was suffering damage at all was a great shock to General Aileen. He knew well how powerful his armor was. Unfortunately for him, things only got worse once Silas' focus turned to him. Directing the ice poison runes, they pierced through the general's armor with more deftness, and soon he was suffering 30 damage a second. Silas easily set 3 of his minds to this task while dodging the blows of the general. General Aileen had long since gotten up, and his speed and dexterity should have been far above Silas' own. However, the ice poison had already begun to sink into his body, and his movement stats had easily fallen by over 20% already. Speed and dexterity were definitely Silas' largest weaknesses in this form, but he was able to combat it with his senses and cleverly placed sheets of ice. Basic etherflow flooded into his legs, layering every kick to the ground and making him even faster. From start to finish, it seemed that Silas had the perfect initiative, and his Arctic Royal class was displaying his strength. Just like he had said when he received it, the poison path was perfect for anyone intent on defeating those far more powerful than themselves. Even though everything was going smoothly, Silas didn't lose his head. His eyes carried the same cold indifference, scanning every little thing and calculating several steps ahead. His left arm was useless right now, and if he slacked and let General Aileen grasp an opening, it would be trouble. Suddenly, the change that he was wary of occurred. General Aileen raised his head to the skies and unleashed a roar. Gwiz General's war cry, FFF+. Plus 50% to all stats. Dispel any active status effects. 100 will temporarily lost for every minute of use. Silas' pupils constricted into pinholes. He sensed and analyzed the skill before it even came, but he had no method of dispelling it. He cast less than stunning Spikine the very next instant, but he was still a step slow. The skill hit the general, and he was instantly frozen in place. Silas erupted with a barrage of attacks, but they just pinged off of the general as though he was nothing more than a fly. This is a problem. Right now, Silas' will was over 3,500 thanks to his silver mastery of madness. However, General Aileen broke free of the effects of stunning Spike, overwhelming it with both his higher quality ether and skill. Still, the brief pause gave Silas the time to make some more distance. What was unfortunate was the fact that there wasn't much distance to be gained, not when an already monstrous opponent had suddenly strengthened by 50%. Silas found a glaive coming down on him from above a mere few breaths later. Without a choice, he was forced to activate Less Than King's shield from the stabilizing bracelet, and knowing it wouldn't be enough, he activated Arctic Howl himself. Arctic Howl, FF, Skill, Legendary Mastery. Defense, 700. Attribute, Ice Poison. Silas timed it perfectly. Unfortunately, it still wasn't enough. General Aileen's glaive tore through his Less Than King's shield greater than, and then right through Less Than Arctic Howl greater than. Silas' gaze flashed, a great sense of danger overwhelming him. But instead of retreating, he took a step forward, crossing his arms and then pressing them up. His ether skin flashed, and his knees buckled as the glaive slammed down. He managed to trap its polearm at his crossed forearms, but it still wasn't enough to stop the blade completely. His shoulder was pierced into, blood spurted, and he released a grunt. One of his arms fell limply, but this was his calculated risk. It was the very same arm he had used Less Than Psychedelic Punch with, so he was already aware that this would happen. A malevolent light flashed in Silas' eyes. Madness surged and pierced right between General Aileen's brows. At the same time, he activated Less Than Mirror Step and his figure separated into several reflective clones. He had already seen through the fact that General Aileen's Warcry skill had taken a hit on his will. It was essentially a berserker skill. In that case, there was another path of victory that had opened up to him. General Aileen shook and shuddered, his eyes going completely red. Taking advantage of the moment, Silas clamped down on the glaive that had sliced into his body, kicking General Aileen's chest at the same time. Flares of basic etherflow rocked the air. Doom, doom, doom. It looked as though 3 consecutive Spartan kicks had landed on General Aileen's chest when in reality, Silas had only kicked out a single time. The general tanked the first, but the second sent him stumbling a step back before Scylla's real foot connected, ripping the glaive out of his control for just a moment. Bang! The glaive exploded into a rain of ash. The general managed to regain control of himself after retreating several meters. He looked up with a ferocious glint, looking for Scylla's to tear him apart. But he ended up running toward a mirror image instead. Scylla's gaze flashed, and all his mirror images moved in unison. The ice poison in the air all focused their attention on the rampaging General Aileen. It was at that moment that Scylla's took out the Arctic Emperor Cobra's venom sac. He had already studied it to the greatest extent possible, allowing him to push these skills to high mastery so quickly. It was about time it became useful for other things. Scylla's slapped his palms together, rupturing the sac. He took control of the runes in the air and forced the poison to condense before wrapping it in his telekinesis and basic etherflow. Less than chilling scythe greater than. General Aileen barreled through a mirror image, only to realize that it wasn't real at all. Then, Scylla's attack descended upon his back, glowing with a beautiful blue-green light that danced with the ancient characters of Earth's laws. Chapter 362, Winner. Scylla's blade practically blinked across space, appearing before the back of the general's neck in a flash. General Aileen hurried to turn around as he sensed something that snapped him out of his berserk state for just a moment. However, that was when Scylla's own gaze flashed. The singular skill was ripped apart, separating into several pieces under his control, and then assaulted the general from all sides. Less than chilling scythe greater than was a skill, even at legendary mastery, that wasn't even close to 200 damage. It was far too weak, and it only got weaker after Scylla split it apart like he did. But he didn't need the skill to attack. He only needed it as a vessel to deliver his real killing blow. As expected, the blades couldn't even pierce through the general's skin. Even though Scylla controlled it to squeeze through the gaps in his armor and assault his weaknesses, it didn't make a difference. However, this was already the result Scylla was expecting. The poison within the less than chilling scythe greater than exploded and coated the general's skin. In that moment, the penetrating power of the ice poison runes all acted at once. If Scylla had to do it himself, even with rune breath, it would be too great of a pull on his mind. He might pass out from the attempt alone. But what was the venom sac of the Arctic Emperor Cobra if not the strongest concentration of ice poison runes, maybe on Earth right now? The general's speed instantly plummeted as he took hundreds of points of damage in the blink of an eye. Scylla didn't rest on his laurels. He couldn't allow the general to dispel the status effect again. His madness bore down on the general's mind with everything he had, interrupting the smoothness of his thoughts. At the same time, Scylla and all of his mirror images rushed at him from all angles. And as though he wasn't satisfied with this alone, Asriel's sword made an appearance. The skies were filled with sword shadows, and General Aileen began to madly punch out at them all. Even after he had shattered several images, he still didn't seem to notice that there was a problem. Scylla circled to his back and unleashed a punch at his head. Less than psychedelic punch greater than. It was a risk. He only had one good arm left, and if he used it like this, he would be helpless if the situation changed again. And yet, despite having already calculated that risk, there was a coolness in Scylla's eyes right now as though he didn't understand how much danger he was putting himself in. Bang! Blood spurted, and Scylla felt his wrist crack against the skull of the general. Strong. General Aileen was truly strong. Such a point-blank blow had only barely broken skin and sent his head snapping forward. He wasn't anywhere close to having his head explode like his steed before him. But this was enough. His skull might be intact, but what about the brain rattling inside? A behind-the-head blow was one of the most dangerous things you could do in boxing. In fact, it was so dangerous that it was illegal. Points would be deducted for a mistake, and egregious examples could lead to outright disqualification. And obviously, those blows couldn't break skulls either. General Aileen stumbled, his eyes losing focus, and his knees wobbling. The poison took hold even further, and the added sluggishness sent him to his knees. Asriel's sword descended from the front, rebounding against his skull again and sending him teetering backward right into a tail whip that Scylla unleashed with everything he had. Scylla could practically feel his abdominal muscles creaking beneath the torque he put him under, but it was like he couldn't feel pain at all. His shin smashed against the side of General Aileen's skull, and the echo of another bone fracturing resonated. Silas hopped back on one foot, gingerly holding his other up in the air. Secretly, he used his tail to maintain his balance so that to the outside viewer, it looked like there was nothing wrong with him at all. His cool, green eyes looked forward with indifference. Slowly, the sound of the crowd faded back into his ears. However, the noise was much quieter than one would have expected. From start to finish, not even 2 minutes had passed. No one could seem to see the savage injuries that Silas had suffered. All they had seen was General Aileen facing loss after loss. Comparatively, there was only a single ghastly wound on Silas' shoulder. As for General Aileen, he had lost his horse, his mind, and now he was bleeding from all 7 orifices. His bloodshot eyes pulled with crimson tears that quickly iced over. Those crimson veins became icy blue, and the last thing anyone saw were ice poison runes dancing in the depths of his eyes before he froze completely. Doom. The general collapsed to the ground, his armor remaining the only thing that stopped him from shattering into countless pieces. Winner, Captain SYLASGRIMBLADE. The crowd lost it, but it was those very few Earthlings who managed to find a method to sneak in that felt the most impact. General Aileen's level, to them, was nothing but a bunch of question marks. They didn't even have the right to see his stats like Silas did. In fact, if not for Madness becoming silver in mastery, Silas would have only seen question marks as well. Their hearts couldn't help but beat wildly. Was it really possible for one of their own to be so powerful already? To kill such an opponent in just 2 minutes? Silas coated his fractured leg with basic etherflow and his telekinesis as his scales faded away. He looked up and met the eyes of City Lord Plinley, a man that he had directly ignored from the very start. Then, he put the corpse of General Aileen and his steed away before vanishing down the same corridor. At that moment, one of the Earthlings in the crowd stored away a device and rushed away, a look of excitement on his somewhat chubby face. Chapter 363, Communication Nexus. Silas leaned against a wall in a secluded place, his breathing heavy. The backlash of fusing with the Basilisk King was somewhat lesser now, but it still wasn't the best. That was why he ended the fight as quickly as possible, even at the cost of heavier injuries. Though, he had a feeling that was the best course of action to take no matter what. The general was incredibly strong, too strong. Silas even had a feeling that he had more skills he wasn't able to get around to using because Silas so quickly pushed him into a corner. The City Lord, by comparison, would only be stronger than that. If Silas wanted to eventually take him down, he would need more strength than just this alone. If only I could get my hands on stronger freeze skills. Silas' will and charisma was so overwhelming when he activated Madness, but he ended up wasting much of it because his skills could be disrupted by stronger skills. Now that he was a general, though, maybe there would be a chance to shore up that weakness. If he could, even if he was fighting against level 50s, he felt that his will and charisma would have a place to do some real damage. That skill that relied on will to trigger is also a good one. If I can get a berserk skill like that, it would definitely be of great help. Silas took a breath, then finished the rest of his slow walk back to his home. The place that he had bought was in a particularly poor part of the town. Ironically, he was a general now, but he lived in a stacked vessel that looked like it might topple over at any moment. But that was the best that he could afford, for now. As a general, he could take advantage of some accommodations in the encampment, but he felt that this place would be far better for some privacy for now. He wasn't going to take any chances. Gwizz General Horse. No genes detected. Seems combat mounts don't have such a function. That's okay. This horse is definitely the perfect material to feed the Stele upgrade crystal. General Aileen. Genes detected. Bronze gene, 4, Strength, F4, Constitution, F3, Dexterity, F3, Speed, F7, Intelligence, F4, Wisdom, F1, Charisma, F. Attempt assimilation. Yes, no. Good. Silas was actually hoping to see a silver gene, but he wasn't surprised that he hadn't. There should be a special leap between bronze and silver, much like there was one between common and bronze. The only unfortunate thing was that even after going through so much trouble, these genes hardly put a dent in the number he needed. What is interesting, though, is that they don't treat these spawned people like beasts, they treat them like normal humans. Beasts only return one gene type at best unless they're the boss of a dungeon. But humans. Killing humans was far more lucrative in this world, to the point Silas felt that the system even did it on purpose. But, considering everything he knew about the powers interfering with Earth now, it was hard to say if it really was the fault of the system any longer. A bronze charisma gene. I have never tried one before, I wonder what it would show me. Silas took a breath and pressed down the urge. First, he needed to recover. Then, he would need to return to the encampment to finish off some bureaucracy matters, and after that, he still had his quest and the library to deal with. Only then would he have the time to consider this matter again. He was tempted to just use these genes to stock up his comprehension again and improve it further. But mental bronze genes were truly too rare. If he kept pushing it off to try and get a bigger harvest, maybe he would be doing more harm to himself than not. We'll see. I'll make a decision again after everything is said and done. The rewards for the title sequence quest should give me a great boost as well, one better than what these bronze genes could theoretically give me. So the library is more important no matter how I look at it. Asterisk. With that thought, Silas began to transmute beast corpses he had caught on the way here into pills. As expected, his recovery was much greater thanks to this. In just 3 hours, he was already back to 100% and was ready to move out. But he didn't know that in just a few minutes, everything would change. In the time that he had been out, a video of his feats had begun spreading around, and a certain merchant was making a great deal of money off of it through the Nexus. In these 3 hours, not only had this video gone viral in the Nexus, but it had netted this merchant enough profit to become an official citizen. With this success, this merchant was able to buy a storefront in the capacity of a citizen, which gave him access to a better Nexus, which only further spread this video around. By the time Silas got up to return to his tasks for the day, the world was set on fire by the name Silas Grimblade once more. Or, rather, it was so in the circles of people with enough backing and influence to have entered the Nexus recently. And as such, news of Silas reached the ears of the Grimblades once again. Before, Silas' life and death were unknown. He had escaped with heavy injuries, and the government, along with Legacy, obviously wouldn't give the Grimblades the full details of what happened. In fact, if not for the merit leaderboard, this news might have been greatly suppressed without them being any wiser. But now, things were different. Silas was about to step out of his door when he frowned. This is possible. A notification had popped up by the side. When his intention moved toward it, something surprising happened. Communication nexus established. Message received. It was from the Grimblades, and the demand was pretty clear: return as quickly as possible. There was no threat, no real command, but the intention was clear enough. After all, his family was still in their hands. Chapter 364, Memory Merchant. Silas looked at this message in silence for a long while. It was from Lucius, expectedly. It was respectful, and there didn't seem to be anything wrong with it as well. But Silas was too intelligent to take it at face value. Still, his expression didn't change. He calmly closed the message and stepped outside. The wind hit him, along with a bit of the foul smell of these slums. He looked up into the skies, his expression calm. Not yet. Silas began to walk, his thoughts churning. He shed the previous suffocating thoughts and began to think. Something must have happened. He walked aimlessly through the streets for about half an hour before he understood. Then, he began a new action plan. An hour later, Silas stood before a shabby shop that had quite a number of guests despite its small size. Making his way through these people was exceptionally easy, because he hardly had to do anything at all. With a snap of his fingers, the city guards moved to his command, and suddenly the entire region was shut down. The merchant didn't even realize what was happening until everyone scattered and Silas walked in. Selvian Guatem. Officially licensed merchant of Guiz City. Level, 7. Profession, Memory Merchant Bronze. Special talent, Record. Greater than, able to record any witnessed memory. Favorability, NA. Silas didn't expect to see such a status screen. The problem wasn't seeing it itself, because with his current scouting skill, plus the boost of Silver Mastery Madness, it wasn't a surprise that he could see this. The real surprise was that he didn't believe that this profession was as simple as it seemed. He looked to the side to find that Selvian had a particular penchant for selling skills. They were weak, most were F, with the very rare occasional F, but that was when Silas realized what his intuition was pointing him toward. Able to record any witnessed memory. The strength of this profession is going to be decided by what the barriers of the word, record, mean. If Selvian knew that Silas had already seen through his greatest secret, he would be doing more than shitting the bricks he already was now. The silence was deafening. Silas didn't seem to be in a rush to speak as he scanned every inch of the store, and every second that passed by was like another weight added to Selvian's chest. "You're recording me right now?" Silas suddenly asked. Selvian choked on his own spit and almost directly passed out. However, the chair behind him caught him, forcing him to wake up again. "You've made quite a bit of money off of me in these days and caused me no small bit of trouble as well." He didn't know what to say. "Tell me, how much money have you made?" "That's not a number," Silas replied. Selvian felt a cold shiver run up his spine. He had never expected that he would bring this sort of trouble to his door. He was just a normal citizen of Gwiz City right now, and Silas was a general who commanded 1,000 warriors, on top of being a baron. Of course, in this context, the baron title was next to useless. But even if he had just been a baron, he would have more than enough ways to deal with Selvian. "I've made over 400,000 F coins." Silas gave him a look. That estimate was much higher than he assumed, but when he thought about it, he would have to have made so much to not only purchase a property but also a storefront like this one. To think he had made so much in just a few hours. It seemed that Silas' face was worth more than he knew. Unfortunately, it wasn't in his calculations for his skill to be known so worldwide. But it was also impossible to account for every variable, especially in this world. The difference between the winners and losers would be decided by how they adapt. "You can record the skills you see." Selvian froze again. How?" The chubby merchant's face went completely pale. Silas was just casually poking at his weaknesses again and again. "What is the limit?" Merchant Gwatem, I can understand if you're feeling a great deal of fear right now, but my time is precious. If you are useful to me, your life will be guaranteed. You used me to reach your current station, and according to the laws of Gwiz City, I could have you executed for using my likeness without my permission, or for recording official military proceedings without permission, or for stealing skills. Every charge made Merchant Gwatem's heart sink further. He hadn't broken any laws, he was sure of it. He had read the rulebook and knew it like the back of his hand. But sometimes, especially in a world like this one where power reigned so supreme, the objective truth didn't matter. So long as it was close enough to the truth, he would be finished. Knowing that he was cornered, Selvian fell to his knees. "I understand. I'll do whatever you need me to do." Silas' gaze narrowed. This was the clearest Selvian's voice had sounded from start to finish. This man wasn't simple by any means, and if Silas treated him like a careless fool, or worse yet, a coward who was easily coerced by fear, then he might end up being the one on the losing end eventually. However, in a battle of wits, even if he would soon be on the other side of the ether plane, Silas would always bet on himself. Plus, very soon, this merchant would come to realize that there was no better umbrella to be under. By the time he had a choice in the matter, he wouldn't want to leave if he was even half as smart as Silas thought him to be. For now, though, he would be a pawn under Silas' thumb. It was the least he could do for all the trouble he put Silas in. Chapter 365, Shake the Foundations. Silas returned to the library. He knew that he couldn't delay Lucius' order for long, or else it would cause trouble for him. If he forced Lucius to use the means he had in his arsenal, it wouldn't end well for either of them. So, he had to be fast. He had already documented all of the books and organized them. Now, he just had to find what he was looking for. What he hadn't expected, though, was to get a useful clue from Merchant Gwatem. Merchant Gwatem's record ability was interesting because how well it worked was entirely dependent on the level of information he was targeting. And, his progress was incredibly slow because his experience gathering was dependent on gathering higher quality information and successfully selling it. It could be said, then, that Selvian had benefited from Silas in more ways than just one. Obviously, the library was one of Selvian's next stops after Silas was gone. But what he didn't expect was that Silas would realize this as well. Silas, however, didn't want the merchant to record the books here. he could already read them all for free. What he wanted the merchant to do was to use his ability to scan the high-priority areas he had noted and pick out the books that his profession noted were more difficult to scan or impossible to scan. This way, Silas could immediately dismiss all of the worthless books and focus on all of the most important ones. What Silas didn't know, however, was that after he asked Selvian to do this, the man struck down the thoughts hidden in his heart. Silas was far too dangerous a man to provoke. It was best to just follow what he said to perfection for now. Only in the future, when he was much stronger, would he consider anything else. It made sense for Selvian himself to think of using his ability in this way. After all, it was his own ability, and he had been trying to think up ways to maximize it for months already. But Silas had not only deduced what his ability was from a few on-the-shelf items, but he had even further deduced how he could maximize it to help Castlemaine, all before he then deduced how to maximize it to help himself. All of this happened within the span of a few minutes, and it left Selvian trembling. Wouldn't this man see through him the moment he had thoughts of betrayal? Silas dismissed Selvian, setting him off to do the tasks they had spoken about earlier. If everything went well, most of Castlemaine's troubles would be dealt with soon. He would just have to trust Kasari to hold down the fort while he was gone, and she was more than capable of it. If not for the fact that she was being targeted by a system city, Castlemaine would likely have found a method of holding on to their top 10 spot like the Enclave had. Now, he had leveled the playing field for her again, so there was nothing to worry about. He took a seat in one of the few seating areas, and there were about 24 or so books before him. These were the books that both potentially filled his needs and had the requisite quality according to Selvian. There was nothing else to do but to read. Silas thought it might take him at least a week or two, but the moment he began, he realized that he had still underestimated himself. His memory had always been excellent, but with the additional wisdom stats and his visualization, it was something else. He was able to concentrate his visualization onto the pages themselves and get an immediate snapshot as though he had just taken a picture with his mind. Because of this, he finished reading what was a textbook-sized tome in just 10 minutes or so. He went through the entire pile of books in just a few hours. After he was finished, he sat back and digested them slowly. Taking a snapshot of a page still wasn't as good as reading it line by line. At best, he could get a feel for it. But when he went back over it, he found that his depth of understanding was greater because he had an overview. He opened his eyes and read the books again. This time, he did it line by line, but it flew by extremely quickly because his mind already had a foggy sense of what was coming. It took him almost triple the time to finish all the books this time, but the result was that he had imprinted every sentence perfectly. Silas took a breath and put down the last book. Rune Enlightenment, Silver, Chain Quest. The people of Earth have a deep and storied history. In its past, much of its language encompassed the secrets of this path and embodied the hope of nations. Fallen and forgotten, the ebbs and flows of time have suppressed this storied heritage. As an Earthling who has rekindled that flame, you share part of this responsibility. Rise up and claim your Rune Enlightenment. Fragmented requirement cleared. Common requirement. Greater than use entry into System City's library to find information about lost civilizations and clues about an ancient dungeon. Common requirement cleared. Bronze requirement. Greater than deduce the location of ancient dungeon. Bronze requirement cleared. Silver requirement. Greater than clear dungeon, the Mountain of Giza. Silas closed his eyes for a long while, seemingly ignoring the notifications. All the information swimming about in his head slowly formed a single realization. When his eyes opened again, the storm that had been hidden within him had calmed. The Mountain of Giza, the Pyramid of Giza, the Afrikor continent, how convenient. He knew exactly where to find a portal to the Afrikor continent. Didn't that bouncer lookalike have a dialect from that continent? And weren't they near Lucius City? Silas stood. He knew that the Afrikor continent was enormous. Even if he had a portal to the continent, that didn't necessarily mean he would have one to what was olden-day Egypt. But it was a good start. Still, that much was the furthest from his mind. Is this really a silver-grade quest? Legacy has been trying to tease apart this mystery for decades. Something told him that there was nothing simple about this matter at all. What Silas didn't know just yet was how right he was. This quest would house a secret capable of shaking the very foundations of Earth. Chapter 366, Don't Let Me Catch You. Kasari frowned when she heard Scylla's words. She didn't expect that he would be returning so soon, but it seemed that it would be inevitable. What's with that look? Scylla asked, observing her face curiously. Kasari snorted. Don't be so full of yourself. I'm worried about that little munchkin. Your antics are going to put her in trouble. The little munchkin she was referring to was, of course, Scylla's little sister. Scylla didn't reply immediately, but before he could, Kasari sighed and apologized. Forget I said that. Hurry up and go before anything bad happens. This was clearly a very difficult situation. She didn't want her current hatred of Scylla to influence her to say anything worse than that. She wasn't exactly the best at controlling her mouth. When is your next spawn coming? Soon, right? I have a few in line that I just haven't used. You're supposed to get one spawn for every upgrade, and one elite spawn for every large upgrade. Until now, I've only summoned Maya, Gregory, and 5 more militiamen. So I have 3 unused normal summons, and 1 upcoming. Scylla nodded. He knew why Kasari hadn't used them. She wanted a special summon, but she didn't have the money to build the residences they would need. Maya, for example, needed a specialty building to perform her best. Gregory needed his own office. Of course, she could just spawn more militiamen, but it felt like a waste since raising the 10 she had now was already annoyingly difficult enough. Most other cities got their warriors by either raising them or conquering other cities. Kasari had taken this approach because she didn't really have another choice. The good news was that all her militiamen had the potential to grow into generals because they were spawns. The bad news was that they were even harder to please because of that, which was why so many of them seemed to almost exclusively follow Gregory's orders now. Still, Scylla could see the confidence growing between Kasari's brows. Now that the external troubles had been forced to yield, she could handle the rest. Okay, Scylla nodded before continuing, this is what I've prepared. He went on to tell Kasari about Selvian before handing her the Gene Elixir formula, the Stellae upgrade crystalline den, and over 200,000 F coins. I've given Selvian a plan of action. I would advise you leave your father by his side so that they can work together now. Things should be easier on you because they can rely on my barony and general titles. As for the formula, special summon an alchemist if you can. The Stellae upgrade crystal has already been loaded with an exceptionally powerful combat mount. It should allow the sperm whale den to become something far more powerful. Do whatever you want with the money, I'm not expecting any of it back. After saying these things, Scylla's prepared to leave again. You're really trying to pay your way into my bed, huh? I feel like a prostitute, she mumbled. This is just what he should do. Reparations for years of trauma, the silent until now Olivia chimed in. Scylla didn't reply, leaving directly. You know, you're going to end up on the losing end if you keep targeting him like that. Kasari said with a laugh. Hey, you immediately start defending him the moment he's gone, where's the sisterhood? Plus, I only lose if you spread your legs. Keep them closed and victory is mine. My pride is riding on you, fight back. Kasari sputtered with laughter, however she couldn't help but gaze toward where Scylla had left. With the foundation he had left behind, she would be able to charge through into township and beyond quite quickly. He had only appeared for barely a week, yet everything was fixed. If she couldn't handle the rest, then she would really be too useless. Her expression flashed with determination. It was time for revenge. All this time, she had been gathering her own tidbits of information, some things she didn't even tell Scylla because she felt that he would go and handle it himself. She didn't want that. These people had been pissing her off for too long and she wanted to take their heads herself. This time, her evil cult was clear in her mind's eye. City leaderboard. 10. The Enclave. She was going to raze them to the ground. Kasari was leaking quite a dangerous aura at the moment, one that took Olivia back a bit. Maybe you two nutcases are meant for each other, she mumbled. Kasari was about to say something when her eyes widened. She stood to her feet quickly and slammed her hands on the desk. That son of a bitch. Kasari's roar was so loud that Scylla heard it even from the basement below. Then, in an unfortunate sight that only he would witness, he actually chuckled. His heart felt light, and the danger he was about to face didn't seem to faze him in the slightest. If he took a step back, fighting it out against that general alien was a foolish choice. A level 27 was far beyond him and he had no business battling it out against such a person. He was lucky that the arena was a confined space, forcing him to remain inside his domain from start to finish, and by extension, there was less room for him to take full advantage of his combat. Mount. Yet, Silas only remembered feeling the thrill. He had phased everything out and all that mattered was killing the opponent before him. If the Grimblades wanted to be that enemy, he would gladly oblige. Until now, he had killed really only out of a matter of necessity. He wondered what would happen to him if he started to kill out of rage instead. As for why Kasari was so mad. You have been conferred the title Baroness, you have been conferred the title Baroness of the Grimblades. Don't let me catch you, Silas Brown. Who the fuck gave you the balls to force me into marriage? Chapter 367, Let's see. Silas exited into the dense steel jungle of York City, but just as quickly left. This time, he didn't need to deal with a storm, and since he still had the boat he had taken from the cottage, it was smooth sailing on his way out. Soon, he had his sights on the portal back to the icy lands of the Arctic tundra. And as the chilly winds hit him, so too did his gaze become just as cold. He seemed to be quite obedient, already returning the moment he got Lucius' message. But he had his own reasons. It was a simple matter for him to delay this return for another week or two. But there were several reasons he didn't. The first was because of the Africor continent portal. The second was because of his family, he had truly been away for too long. And the third reason. Silas stepped into the snowy plains, the wind buffeting him from all sides. It felt colder than he remembered, which was odd, especially since his stats were far stronger now. However, that didn't stop him from feeling quite relaxed. After all, he had a great affinity for this chilliness now. Silas brought out the Mance's wand. Mance's wand, silver, treasure. The paths of the Mance are long and complex. There is no one path that is superior to another, but the distance one can travel depends greatly on your strength of heart. The Mance's wand allows you to feel and sense your path of the Mancer, how to progress it, and how to improve it. How far you can see down this road will be decided by your own personal insight. This was his third reason. He needed to be in a region that matched his affinity in order to see the effects of the wand, so returning was only natural. But how long he would stay here was another matter entirely. If it suited him, he wouldn't mind spending several days in the depths of this cold. Silas sensed the changes to the Mancer wand silently, trying to see what it wanted to tell him. He wasn't completely certain that it would give him what he needed. The description of this treasure was more vague than any other he had ever seen. However, soon, he began to feel something odd. Silas paused. Follow. He began to allow the wand to move on its own, and he quickly followed after it. He ended up summoning his blue cyclone horse, but it was clearly much slower in the snow than normal. Still, it was faster than walking himself. What Silas didn't expect was that it would take him half a day to reach his destination. He was forced to take 2 breaths in between, not just for his mount's stamina, but that of his own as well. Keeping the Mancer wand activated took a great deal of ether. The good news was that he had not only reached his destination, but he felt that less than mad and enlightenment was on the verge of silvery mastery. That would be another huge boost to him. The region Silas had reached was colder than any other he had been to. Even with his constitution and affinity, he still felt a biting cold and goosebumps crawled up his skin. For the first time since he had come to the Arctic tundra, he wanted something to bundle himself up. But he had already come too far. He could only thicken his ether skin and look forward with a pensive expression. The location could only be called an Arctic oasis. There were trees and foliage of crystalline ice, and in the middle there was a crystal-clear lake that should have long since frozen under this sort of cold, but still somehow managed to remain liquid. Around this lake, there was a dense pack of creatures separated into 2 groups. On one side, there were Arctic king cobras in numbers larger than Silas had ever seen before, and that was saying something considering he had been attacked by more than 50 of them before. On the other, there was a pack of polar bears. However, rather than having black marbles for eyes, theirs were an icy blue that looked as though they had replaced them for polished balls of ice. No matter where you looked, all of these creatures were powerful. Though, it seemed that the Arctic king cobras were being a bit suppressed. Is it because of me? Silas couldn't help but wonder. The cobras only occupied about 30 to 40% of the surrounding lake land. By comparison, the polar bears had the rest and seemed to arrogantly look down on the cobras. They had human interactions from time to time that made them easy to read, almost like they were toddlers. If I'm correct, if the Arctic Emperor Cobra died and left a gap in leadership, that would give these polar bears the chance to make their move. But there's no clear gap in their stats. That can only mean that the polar bears have a creature that's likely to be on the same level as the Arctic Emperor Cobra. Silas was only making a guess, but if he was right, this place was definitely not one he could easily take advantage of. It also had to be remembered that the Arctic Emperor Cobra was only in the middle of an evolution. What if the Arctic Emperor Bear, if one really existed, had completed theirs? Still, this was good news for Silas. That lake should be the core reason for the evolution of these beasts, or at least one of them. And it had the ice poison affinity that was perfect for him. He didn't necessarily need to risk himself either to use it. The Mansa wand wasn't some guide. The only reason it had led Silas here was because he used it as a proxy to sense ice poison ether. The real purpose of the Mansa wand was to distill the ether in the surroundings into a form he could observe and comprehend. He wondered what he could learn just by allowing the Mansa wand to lurk here. Let's see. Chapter 368 Rune. Silas backed away from the edge of the valley he was peeking over. After some thought, he started to dig into the thick snow around him and buried himself in a small cave within. The Mansa wand hovered before Silas and he closed his eyes, focusing everything he had on it after summoning the Basilisk King. The Basilisk King played the role of protector while Silas focused. It was about time he found out the true use of the Mansa wand. To get here, it could be said that he took advantage of a loophole of sorts. But now, Silas took a breath and less than maddened enlightenment activated on its own. It was so subtle that Silas didn't even notice. Under normal circumstances, he might have. But at the moment, his mind had been pulled into a world of fluttering ice blue snowflakes. An illusion. It didn't feel real, but at the same time his body couldn't help but shiver. Greater than basic affinities. Ice, bronze. Poison, bronze. Ice poison, common. Silas remembered the affinities his class had given him. Was this what this world was supposed to improve? No, it's something more complicated than that. This world wasn't as organized as the rune-practicing world he had been in before. There was no structure, and seemingly no beginning and end. Recalling the description of the Mansa wand, he understood. Somewhat, he was supposed to rely on himself to find the path. It would allow him to sense his path of the Mansa more clearly, but how far he managed to take it was entirely reliant on himself. The benefits of having higher affinity are clear. Controlling runes in battle like I did increased the strength of my ice poison skills substantially, and it helped me to resist higher order countering skills as well. Theoretically, if I increase my affinity any further, the benefits should speak for themselves. I should also see if I can find any pure ice or pure poison skills as well, because their affinity is even higher than my ice poison affinity alone. Silas shook his head. He was getting distracted. One thing at a time. Right now, his path was ice poison, not ice or poison. What he needed to understand was a method of maximizing it because there was already no going back. The Madness Key told him that there was no one Mansa path that was above another. But was that strictly true? Technically, the answer the Madness Key gave him was overseeing everything from a lofty peak. Meaning, it was extrapolating the greatest potential of every path of the Mansa. But in Silas' opinion, there would definitely be differences that would be the most clear at the start. And whether a weaker path could even become a stronger one would be hinged on how hard a person would have to work. What if choosing certain more powerful paths more easily guaranteed reaching that peak the Madness Key was looking down from? If he looked at things this way, he felt almost subconsciously that ice poison was superior to ice and poison alone. But why? Silas looked around, trying to feel what the Mansa wand wanted him to see. However, even after several minutes, all he had were vague inklings. Silas frowned. He wasn't used to running into such brick walls. But in the rare instances he did, it only made him more focused. He tried to walk around, but the world was the exact same no matter where he went. If anything, the chill was only becoming worse rather than better, as though his affinity was actually regressing the longer he spent here. What Silas didn't know was that this was exactly what was happening. The Mansa wand was looking at the world from the height of a silver grade affinity, while Silas' own ice poison affinity was at a mere common grade. Essentially, Silas was like a grade schooler trying to learn from a PhD program's research paper. He had a huge gap in knowledge that he hadn't filled, but now he was trying to take that leap all at once. Ironically, the Mansa wand was actually too strong of a treasure. On top of that, its effects were too vague for even the likes of Silas to understand this clearly. No, I need a different approach. Silas came to a stop, his brows furrowed. Runes. Silas activated Enchanted Scholar, but it didn't work. The world was still the same blanket of ice blue. Is it because I'm not technically in my body right now? Silas frowned. Enchanted Scholar allowed Silas to see runes, but it was a gene first and foremost. It was a literal part of his body. But right now, this was a projection of his mind, it was impossible to use. He hadn't thought about it before, but to think genes actually had such a limitation. Does rune breath have such a limitation? Silas never tried to use rune breath without activating Enchanted Scholar at the same time. But, technically speaking, it shouldn't need the latter. With that thought, Silas tried. A flashbang went off in his mind and it was as though a star had just exploded right before his eyes. Too much. It was too much too quickly, and he felt that his mind was rapidly draining. He hurriedly activated less than maddened enlightenment greater than, only to realize that it was already active. Activating rune breath in this state almost felt like he had just poured alcohol into an open wound. Normally, his body was like his shield of skin, but right now, it wasn't here, so there was no filter as the runes practically acted on him directly. That was when Silas understood something. Runes and his mind, or his soul, maybe. They were both made out of the same substance. That was the only reason such a thing was possible. The moment Silas had this thought, the world fell into silence and the runes around him became even more obedient. Silas didn't know what happened exactly, but he knew that he had had a breakthrough. He had stepped from rune breath to rune soul. Chapter 369 Missing. Silas, of course, didn't know what any of this meant. Rune breath was already described as something that separated the talented from the talentless, but it was still only a matter of a few seconds for him to grasp. So, he had no appreciation for the difficulty. Rune soul wasn't just one level above rune breath, it was two. Rune breath was preceded by rune flesh. Rune flesh was a state of being able to incorporate runes into one's very body. Of course, there would be limits, but it was essentially known as the state where one no longer needed to use ether as a medium in order to use runes. This meant that even in regions where ether wasn't dense, Silas would still be able to make use of runes, and observe them clearly. Rune flesh was actually something that Silas had personally experienced before. It was precisely what happened every time a gene was absorbed. Extricate made this experience all the more potent and allowed one to benefit from the comprehension of said genes as well, while the system streamlined the process. Rune Soul was an even more powerful version of this. It allowed one to incorporate runes right into the very soul. There was no simple one-to-one comparison for it, at least not on current Earth. Silas could vaguely feel these changes, but he was quickly distracted by the world around him. He made a note to ask the Madness Key about such things later. But right now, there was only one place that was of interest to him. The world of ice blue seemed to, ironically, gain color in Silas' eyes. It was as though it had gained true life. Everywhere Silas looked, there was one rune after another. He saw several iterations of what he thought was the ice poison rune, but many of them were weaker than the ice poison rune he was familiar with, and there were several that were stronger than the rune he was familiar with. All of them are ice poison. Are they bits and pieces of a whole? Something else. Silas never thought that there were multiple iterations of the ice poison rune because he had already seen it in two completely different states. One was from the much weaker venom sac of the Arctic Emperor Cobra's son, and the other was from the Arctic Emperor Cobra itself. The ice poison runes on both venom sacs were the exact same. Were they, though? Silas frowned for a moment and then backed out of the Mansa wand's world. He quickly took out one of the corpses of the Arctic King Cobras that remained in his Madness Key and cut out the venom sac. He didn't need to be nearly as careful as he had been in the past as he was immune, so the process was quick. Soon, he was observing the venom sac closely. Another. Silas began to cut out venom sac after venom sac, but the result was the same. They really are the same. I knew I wouldn't make a mistake like that. But why does the Arctic Emperor Cobras feel so different? A realization came over Silas. Ether. The maturity and strength of one's ether could influence and change runes as well. The Arctic Emperor Cobra was on the verge of an evolution, so even though it had the same rune, its presence, power, and aura were entirely different. Silas entered the Mansa One's world again. So what was this place? Building blocks, Silas thought after a long while. If I had to bet, if I captured an Arctic King Bear right now, they might have a slightly different rune than the Arctic King Cobras had. They had access to the same building blocks, but they took a different path. In that case, does that mean that if I want to grasp ice poison to the silver grade 1 need to? Silas looked around him. Comprehend it all. The gap between Silas and what it would take to do something like this was tremendous. It felt like everywhere he looked there was a new rune to look at, or a slightly different twist on one he had already seen. The ice poison rune he had learned had much more concentration in its piercing power. It was actually much more poison than it was ice. Or rather, more like venom. However, here, he saw ice poison runes that were far more overbearing, ones where a single touch could freeze you down to your very cells themselves. There were some that needed to be more airborne so that they could be inhaled, and were as such far more poison-like in nature. No. Silas changed his mind again. He didn't believe that he needed to understand all of these just to reach the silver grade. It actually felt like the world was endless and there were a seemingly infinite number of variations and changes amongst these runes. He recentered himself, remembering that this world wasn't about teaching him what to do, but was rather here to help him find his own path of the Mansa. If he got lost in trying to comprehend everything, he would just shoot himself in the foot. Of course, he would still use this world as a cheat to grasp the 50 foundation rune he needed to complete his quest, but that didn't mean that he should choose randomly. If he was going to learn one, he should learn one using the path he wanted. The deeper he went into the world, the more complex the runes became until he started seeing his first few runes that were well beyond 30 foundations in size. He saw a few that were 40, and then he began to see the sparse scattering of 50 foundation runes. Although these runes only felt slightly more complicated than the 20 and 30 foundation runes he had been seeing before, for some reason, Silas felt that they were touching on much more profound concepts nonetheless. There seemed to be a clear divide between runes below 40 foundations and ones above 40. As he went deeper, he didn't even see a single 60 foundation rune. Something feels missing. Silas looked back toward the runes he had skipped over. I see. A subtle hint of an understanding came over Silas. If I want to access these stronger runes, it means that I'm already abandoning the path of ice poison and accepting that I will need to take in another affinity in the near future. If I go back to the weaker ones, then I can continue along with my ice poison path. Silas didn't need to think, he had already made his decision. He needed something stronger. The words of the Madness Key was the song that kept driving him stronger. Become strong. Chapter 370 Decision. Silas' gaze flashed with a determined light. It was the same reason he was taking the risk of remaining a level 0, the same reason he put himself in dangerous situation after dangerous situation, the same reason he was about to make the choice he was now. Immediate power sounded nice, but he knew that rising to the top of Earth was merely a start, merely the beginning. No one had ever told him, but he didn't need to be a rocket scientist to figure it out. And ironically, he just might be one of the few people on Earth smart enough to be exactly that. Earth was only a grade 10 bronze world. That meant that there were other much higher order worlds out there. Just like he was born with an unranked blade aura gene, there might be others out there who had complete silver genes from birth, maybe there were even some with complete legendary genes from birth. Babies that had stats in the quadruple digits before they were even potty trained. Silas wasn't naive. The dangers he faced now were just small fry compared to what he was sure he would have to face in the future. And if he wasn't even content with being a Grimblade subordinate now, how could he be willing to be under a much bigger thumb in the future? What would decide how far he went would be the choices he made right here and right now. he had no assurance that he would be able to remain level 0 until he unlocked legendary genes. However, he had to ensure that he did everything he could to maximize his foundation now so that in the future, when he inevitably had to compromise on something, it wouldn't be as big of a hit. A green fire blazed in Scylla's eyes as he calmed. He began to observe the strongest of the runes around himself and began to make distinctions between them. Eventually, he had divided them into 8. These 8 runes were neither stronger nor weaker than one another, but they were all incomplete in one way or another. In addition, they were all around 50 or so foundations in size. Scylla gave them all colloquial names like he had done in the past. He named them as follows: slow, freeze, decay, life, order, balance, disorder, divine. The slow rune seemed to constrict everything in its surroundings. It wasn't as simple as seeping into one's muscles and making an opponent slow, but it slowed down even the ether in the air, even freezing over runes themselves. One could imagine that at an extreme, this slow rune might be able to delay or even disrupt even skills, or gene talents. Freeze seemed similar to slow in that they acted very much the same. In fact, so did decay and disorder. The differences between them all was exceptionally subtle, and they wouldn't become more obvious until Scylla began to progress them down the paths. Still, freeze was also able to attack the ether and runes in the air, but it didn't make them languid. Instead, it separated them, making them seem a world away and locked in a separate space. By comparison, decay and disorder assaulted rune and ether in the same way, but rather than just disrupting them, they began to damage them. Scylla wouldn't even be surprised if part of what happened to Earth's runes were related to other runes much like these ones. The only difference between decay and disorder right now was that one destroyed and the other disrupted and disorganized. Life, order, balance, and divine were like opposite sides of the 4 coins that were just described. The order ice poison rune didn't just freeze runes in place, but cobbled them together, forcing them into a subordinate role and gathering them in place. Life was similar, but it forcefully converted the runes into ice poison, commandeering their energy and taking it for itself. Balance and divine were probably the most complex of all 8. On the surface, balance seemed to be exactly like life, taking runes in the surrounding and converting it, but this wasn't the entire truth. It also allowed a reversal, allowing ice poison to become something else rather than forcefully converting everything else. Divine was also similar to life, but if Scylla had to describe the difference, life had to force the runes in the surroundings into submission, while divine was able to make them follow through of their own accord. It was a subtle difference, but a powerful one nonetheless. With just this information on hand, Scylla was having a hard time picking just one. He even felt that he should at least pick 2 and try to balance them out. Maybe pick one that was more inclined toward the ice side and another that was more inclined toward the poison side and then bring them together. But even after he had this thought, he was having a hard time narrowing it down to just 2 even with such concessions. They were all powerful runes, and there seemed to be some that he might prefer now, but who was to say that he would still prefer them in the future? It had to be remembered that all of these runes were incomplete. In the future, Scylla would have to find something to stabilize them or add to them, and they would then change. So the decision he was making now wasn't just based on what he saw before him, but he also had to extrapolate into the future. If he couldn't do that, he would end up handicapping himself. For example, divine. The ability to subdue other runes and guide them into obedience almost like a rune breath for his ice poison rune sounded great. In fact, it might be the strongest current ability here. But how did it scale? How would he use it in the future? It was almost like he was taking his ice poison rune and making it a jack of all, master of none. Scylla's brain continued to churn until his heart settled down. He had made a decision. Chapter 371 Unyielding. His decision was quite unexpected, maybe even to him. When he initially started, he didn't think that he would go this route. But the more he thought about it, the more he felt that this was the best route to take. Slow and freeze. Scylla was relying on one thing to make this decision: affinity. If the madness key didn't lie to him, then every single one of these paths could lead to the pinnacle. In fact, every single one of the others in this man's wand world could as well. It was just a matter of if he could take it there. What the madness key didn't promise him was the ease of doing so. Scylla had already taken the harder road by boxing himself into taking one of these 8. Or, rather, 2 of these 8. However, as he had said in the beginning, there would also be certain things that he would inevitably have to compromise on in the future. Never mind the fact that he didn't believe he was compromising right now at all. The reason he picked slow and freeze were simple: they were the 2 that embodied the affinity he felt for ice poison the most. Slow was the most like poison, it seeped into the runes and ether of the world, making them languid and lethargic. If one carelessly used a skill in its presence, it would show its dominance. Even a gene talent might not be safe at all. Freeze was the most like ice. It boxed runes and ether in, freezing them into their own separate blocks and barring them from the rest of the world. Of all of these 2 were without a doubt the closest to ice poison, and though they would definitely need stabilizing just like the others would, it would also be far easier to succeed in doing so. Silas was happy with his choice and began with slow first. What he didn't expect was that it would be far more complex than he thought. The slow ice poison rune had 51 foundations, but there were 382 strokes. This was more than 3 times that of the number of strokes that the normal ice poison rune had. Freeze was much the same. In fact, they both had an identical number of foundations and strokes. The problem wasn't just the number of strokes, but also how they were layered. The sequence was much more complex, and sometimes Silas actually found himself mistaking a single stroke for what was actually a combined 2 or 3. He had to re-evaluate several times before he came down to the final number. Interesting. If he had still been at the Rune Enlightenment realm, or even still the Rune Breath realm, this would have definitely been a challenge that had him stuck for a while. But now, a few hours should be enough. Silas froze some time over a half-day later. A bang seemed to have gone off in his mind and the pain came in violent waves. Title: Unyielding Scholar, FFF+. Embryo of Chaos, dense in its unpredictability and lofty in its ambition. You are not only sharp, but your wisdom is no less powerful than your will. Devours blazing will. Plus 200 wisdom. Plus 200 will. Plus 100% wisdom. Blood oozed out of Silas' nose in the real world and he almost collapsed. Name: Silas Grimblade. Species: Human, F. Affiliation: Grimblade lineage. Class: Arctic Royal, Fragmented. Profession: Vipermancer, FFF+. Level: 0. Coins: 41,387, F. Titles: A Burning Will, System Breaker, Legendary Tamer, Surge of the Die, Baron of Gwiz, Unyielding Scholar, FFF+, Skill Savant, FFF+, Madness Conqueror, FF, Common Arts Enthusiast, F, Aid Patient Stalker, F. Physical: 148. Greater than Strength, 140 greater than Constitution, 170 greater than Dexterity, 140 greater than Speed, 140 Mental, 437 greater than Intelligence, 267 greater than Wisdom, 844 greater than Charisma, 200 Will, 803 Luck, 22. Skills: Madness Control, FF+, Basic Scouting, F, Maddened Enlightenment, FF+, Astral Bind, F+, Momentum Shift, F+, Solidify, F+, Master Scouting, FFF, Stunning Spike, FF, Astral Wolfishin, FF, Mirror Step, FF, Psychedelic Punch, FF, Master Counter, FFF, Comprehensions, Madness, FFF. Gene State: Rigid. Fragmented Genes, Grimblade Lineage, F, Voice of a King, F, Common Genes. Bronze Genes, Basic Etherflow, F, Enchanted Scribe, F. The synergy between his legendary Tamer title and his new Unyielding Scholar title showed their full strength. He got plus 100% wisdom from both, but he got plus 100% will from legendary Tamer on top plus 20% from a burning will. The unfortunate thing was that they didn't stack and were instead applied separately. So rather than his plus 200 wisdom becoming plus 800, it instead began plus 600. However, his original 122 wisdom still got its own plus 100% to 244, racking up the total of his current wisdom. Silas coughed and wheezed, his mind buzzing. He had already asked the Madness Key in the past if it was safe to do this. And technically it should be since it was his foundation being excavated and deepened, but that didn't make it hurt any less. In addition, he would be weak for a period afterward, which was why he had been studying both runes at the same time before he comprehended them both. However, now he couldn't help but wonder. Now what? Now that he had comprehended the runes, what did that do for him? His ether composition didn't seem to have changed, and his ice poison affinity was still common. He couldn't help but wonder what he was missing. Maybe. Silas decided to wait it out. He used less than maddened enlightenment to try and ease his splitting headache, only to be pleasantly surprised to find that it had finally reached silver mastery. His speed in recovering ether and from mental fatigue had taken an enormous leap forward, especially since with madness, it could now be at gold mastery. An hour later, Silas finally felt that he was back up to 100% and began his little experiment. He expelled all the ether from his body, then began to use less than maddened enlightenment to replace it. Nope, still not working. The ether he received in return was the exact same. It seemed that he would have to take a more hands-on approach. Silas began to sift through the ether in the world, rejecting what he didn't want and only accepting those that fit. Slowly, his ether pathways began to freeze over. A feeling of discomfort overwhelmed him and Silas felt like his body was about to be poisoned itself. His pupils constricted. This ether was too high level for his body. He was killing himself. Chapter 372, Lost in a World. Silas hurriedly stopped, but the bloating didn't go away. In fact, it was slowly getting worse. Thinking quickly, he began to gather up the ether to form a thicker and thicker layer of ether skin, but just the process of expelling the small bits of ether he had gathered was so painful. His pores were forcefully dilated, and there was even a bit of a poison etch being drawn across his skin. Clearly, his immunity was still there, but only in part. As such, his body was fighting back as viciously as it could beneath this new and improved ether. It took Silas several minutes before he managed to reverse the situation, but that didn't change the pain his body was under. Luckily, he had noticed the issue quickly, mostly thanks to his experience with intelligence genes allowing him to be very sensitive to the changes in his ether pathways. Otherwise, he might have accidentally hit a point of no return before he even understood what had happened. He exhaled a breath, but it was frosty and cold, carrying a hint of a blue tinge. My class is limiting me. His Arctic Royal class was able to allow him a natural affinity to catalyze the ether in his surroundings into ice poison, or rather, the ice poison that he was innately familiar with. However, it didn't allow him to be immune to any and all ice poison. His affinity seemed to be limited to common, but this wasn't an arbitrary limit. It was a limit decided by his class, and also a reminder that his body couldn't take in more than that. Silas frowned. He had just made a great breakthrough, and learned to control two new forms of ice poison that he believed had great potential. But if he didn't have the ether control to back it, while it wouldn't be entirely useless in battle, it certainly wouldn't be as effective as it should be. Taking a breath, Silas steadied himself. Maybe. Silas delved into his body, trying to find his ether pathways. He always had vague feelings about where they were, but he, much like everything else, mostly relied on skills to trigger on their own. It was only after the ether in the surroundings was moving like he wanted could he use his mastery over runes to amplify them. It wasn't an internal process. Even when Silas used ether skin, it was just a general process of osmosis, moving something from an area of higher concentration to lower. He was essentially just opening up his pores to allow his ether to flow to and coat his skin. This didn't require knowing exactly ether pathways either. But right now, he felt like he needed that, and he also felt that he knew exactly how he was going to find them. Silas brought out his reward for the month, a 3-day flexible elixir. Then, he downed it. He was already about 3/4 of the way through the month now, so he might as well finally use it since he was getting another soon. Plus, he had a feeling that it was about time he needed such a thing anyway. Silas felt his body open up and almost bloom. He had had many gene elixirs before, but this was the first time he was having such a powerful one, and the difference truly showed. He couldn't help but wonder if 65% felt so good, what would it feel like to have a free body where he could take in 100% of all the genes he tried to. Silas refocused himself. First, he amped himself up on common genes, using extricate every time. It was almost too easy for him to reach his cap of 20 common genes, at least for the physical stats, due to the sheer number of beasts he had killed and caught until now. He had been planning on using them with his transmutation beast skin, but that wasn't necessary for now. After putting himself in a state of wealth, he brought out General Aileen's corpse and used extricate on one of his intelligence genes. He moved so fast that he didn't even notice that his physical stats had actually ticked upward as fatigue hidden deep within his body was washed away. But there was a reason he didn't notice. That was because he immediately hit the jackpot. The first intelligence gene he absorbed was a resounding success, but what shocked Silas even more was that the feeling was far more potent than anything he had ever experienced. This wasn't the first time he had absorbed a bronze gene, so what was the difference? His first thought was that it was the flexible gene elixir. It was truly powerful, and it was only natural that it had such changes. But he dismissed this thought. Although this was a successful absorption, he had already reached his cap of 2 bronze genes. That meant that although it felt like he had successfully absorbed this gene, his body was soon about to reject it. The flexible gene elixir thus couldn't possibly display its full strength. That was when it hit Silas. Runes. Indeed, genes really didn't look a lot like runes after he used extricate on them. Extremely complex runes, but runes nonetheless. Could his breakthrough to rune breath be helping? What Silas still didn't know was that he had already comprehended rune flesh and rune soul. The potency of the feeling extricate gave him, as a result, was many times more. To put this matter into perspective, the difference between Silas now and before was akin to if the Silas of before had managed to use extricate on a gold gene. He was able to get the same potency of experience a layman would get from a gold gene with a mere bronze gene simply by virtue of his comprehension of runes. And that came with benefits that were truly hard to describe. Even Silas couldn't because he was completely lost in this world. The world of his ether pathways. Chapter 373, FF+. When Silas absorbed the common genes earlier, he had already felt that something was wrong. The feeling was too sharp, too shocking. He found himself making a great deal of improvement, but he was more focused on speeding his way through to get to the bronze intelligence gene, so he hadn't paid nearly enough attention. But now, all of that seemed to come together at once. For the first time, it felt to Silas like he was looking at an MRI of his own body, as though someone was able to videotape and document his own organ systems in 4K. He went from being only able to vaguely sense the location of his ether pathways, to feeling like they were extensions of his own limbs. He subconsciously chose to circulate a simple skill, less than chilling scythe greater than. And he watched as his ether moved along the pathways, forming a rune pattern of their own, and then imprinting that rune into the outside world. When that rune took shape, the atmospheric ether responded and formed the body of less than chilling scythe greater than. He could feel the ebbs and flows of the skill. He could speed up its casting, decide its shape and size, even twist and change the potency of energy concentration within it all before it formed. Silas began to play around with the mastery, checking and feeling what changes there were to the system's triggering of the skill when mastery was either high or low. The feeling of basking in the presence of this gene, even though he couldn't absorb it, also lasted far longer than any time before. If Silas was lucky, he would get a few dozen seconds to immerse himself in this feeling in the past. But now, several minutes had gone by and it still didn't show any sign of weakening or slowing. In fact, Silas found that he would even slow down the process of the gene being expelled from his body due to what he thought was rune breath, but was in reality rune soul. It took over 10 minutes before the feeling finally slipped away from him, but it left behind a Silas with a gaze so bright it practically melted the snow all around him. The ether pathways aren't a normal organ system. They're a quasi-ethereal organ system mostly made up of a series of runic connections. There's some flesh that plays a part in it, but only insofar as this flesh allows it to latch onto the body. Beyond the ether pathways, there seems to be a kernel or a seed of some sort hidden away in the heart. That location is actually also where my gluttony seed is, and the size of that seed in my heart should be dictated by how high my intelligence stat is. All sorts of things Silas didn't understand before were now as clear as day to him. If I want to use a higher form of ether, I will need a stronger ether pathway. But messing around with that complicated system, it's still too far beyond me. Silas' mind churned, trying to find a solution, but it seemed quite bleak and hopeless. It had taken him about a day to master 252 foundation runes. but the number of foundations his ether pathways were made out of, let alone the seed in his heart, was so many that he didn't even bother to count them. It was certainly into the thousands, and the stronger his intelligence became, the further away it would be from him to master and control. It seemed like one had to rely on the system to make these changes, otherwise you would simply be asking for death, or even in the best-case scenarios, crippling. Someone had to have created the system. Silas suddenly thought, his gaze flashing with a blaze of green flames. If someone else had managed to create the system to automate such a complicated process, Silas didn't believe he wouldn't be able to in the future. It was just that that future was too far away from him right now. It was a shame. Silas hadn't had that unique ether for long, but he had already noticed benefits. His ether skin before had 200 defense, for example. But with this new ether skin, it had over 400. That was a casual sort of protection that would mean the vast majority of people on Earth couldn't even harm him even if he stood there and let them hit him. But if his body couldn't handle it, there was nothing he could do. Unless. Silas' gaze flashed. He couldn't tweak his ether pathways right now, but what about tweaking his skills? Was it possible to use a lower form of ether to trigger the action of a higher form? Technically speaking, this was impossible. Skills worked, as Silas knew now, by forming a rune in one's ether pathways and then communicating with the world. The strength of that call to action was dependent, obviously, on the strength of the ether you used. This was why runes scaled with ether potency and not just strokes and foundations. However, what if a skill was working in conjunction with rune breath? Silas had already gotten used to using his runes to amplify his skills, and this should be one level beyond that. If I tweak the circulation pattern of my skill to trigger slow ice poison runes or freeze ice poison runes, then I can use rune breath to make those higher order runes more likely to listen to me even though I used a lower order ether. Silas immediately began to put this into action. The more he practiced, the brighter and brighter the glow in his eyes became until a small curve tugged at the corner of his lips. He hadn't had this much fun in a very long while. You have pleased the system, system breaker. The system is watching you. System reward received. Chilling Scythe Mutant, FF plus, skill, legendary mastery. Damage, 250. Special damage, 100 sec for 5 seconds. Special effect, speed minus 50% for 5 seconds. Attribute, ice poison. Silas' expression flickered. How could an FF plus skill be so strong? Chapter 374, Mutant. Chilling Scythe Mutant, FF plus, skill, legendary mastery, damage, 250. Special damage, 100 sec for 5 seconds, special effect, speed minus 50% for 5 seconds, attribute, ice poison. Silas built this skill by modifying the skill's circulation pattern based on his understanding of the slow ice poison rune. There was much more overlap between this skill and slow than there was between it and freeze, so it was the obvious path to take. But he didn't expect that it would have such a large effect on the overall strength of the skill. Not only did its attack power almost double, its special damage almost guaranteed that most opponents he came across would die within 5 seconds. Of course, they could still use a counter skill, or a skill that dispelled special effects, but something told Silas that it wouldn't be nearly as easy to do now as it had been in the past. Silas had traded for his own countering skill before he left Wiz City, so now he was much more aware of their limitations and what might hold them back. However, Silas knew that this wasn't the matter he should be focused on right now. What kind of changes could he make to his other ice poison skills? The moment he had this thought, he turned his attention to his strongest skill, less than Arctic King's domain greater than. Unfortunately, he was immediately stonewalled. The skill was too complicated, and it felt that his legendary mastery of it was just a farce. Not only did it take him several seconds to cast unlike the others, but it had so many layers that Silas knew he could just as easily weaken it as he could strengthen it. It would take me at least 3 days to succeed. I can't afford to waste that time, not yet. 3 days felt like a short time, but to Silas, who was on a timer not just for himself, but for Kasari and his own family as well, it was too much to invest. He had to find a balance between improvement and time taken, or else he would lose everything. Less than Arctic Howl greater than, however. Just like less than Chilling Scythe was perfect for his slow ice poison rune, less than Arctic Hal was absolutely made for his freeze ice poison rune. Hours later, Silas had a result that he was very happy with. Arctic Hal Mutant, FF Plus, Skill, Legendary Mastery. Defense, 1000. Special Effect, freeze attack in space for a moment. Limit, 1500 attack. Attribute, Ice Poison. He gained an extra 300 defense, and a special effect on top of that. Meaning, even if he ran into an attack too powerful for his defense to top or block, he would gain an extra split second of time to react so long as he deployed less than Arctic Hal Matan fast enough. If he one day found enough time to improve less than Arctic King's domain like he wanted, he wondered just how much more powerful would it become. However, these improvements to his skills didn't come without a cost. They took a bit longer to cast, about half a second instead of near instantaneously like before. That could definitely be a problem in a tight situation, but that was still the least of his worries. The main issue was that it put more pressure on his mind because he wasn't just casting a skill, he was controlling runes at the same time. If not for him comprehending rune soul and improving his wisdom so much, the former Silas would have been exhausted after casting it once. But now, there was yet another thing draining his mind. Still, Silas checked through his other skills to see if there was anything that he could easily improve, but he didn't find anything. Unfortunately, this method only worked with compatible skills that fit into an ice poison mold. Without it, he would be recreating a whole new skill from scratch, and that would take even longer to accomplish than improving less than Arctic King's domain greater than. Hold on. Silas' gaze flashed. There was still less than psychedelic punch greater than. Right now, he could only use it twice in battle, and it came at the cost of his arms. It was a powerful skill, especially considering its grade. But wasn't that only because his visualization was so powerful? Would it be possible for him to use a rune as a visualization instead and weaken the backlash? Then he would be able to use this skill more often, though it would certainly be weaker. He could hold off on using his Serpentis Beast Totem as a visualization for when he really had his back against the wall. Right now, his only ice poison attack was less than chilling Scythes. His affinity was better made for control skills and defensive skills. But it is possible. Silas' gaze flashed. But it's not straightforward. A rune alone isn't enough, I need to give it form and substance, and that requires using basic etherflow. But once I do. Silas punched out incredibly slowly, a complex ice blue rune appearing before his fist. A frosty energy rippled from his knuckles and the space around his arm crackled as though the very water vapor was being frozen over in real time. Silas pulled back his punch before he unleashed it. It definitely worked, increasing his strength by about 50% or so. Compared to the well over 100% of his beast totem visualization, this was much smaller. But the backlash on him was much less nonetheless. Unfortunately, his ice poison really wasn't designed to attack. He could feel it resisting him and fighting back against his attempts at attack. It just didn't work. If he tried to use this attack in battle, much of the strength would dissipate because it had the tendency to want to become an area of effect attack. So, although there was a 50% boost, the effectiveness plummeted and would ultimately make it weaker than his normal punch. It wasn't worth the ether. I feel like there's still potential here, but it would take more studying. I can't finish this in a single sitting either. It might just be better to find a more suitable technique. After he had this thought, Silas stood. It was time to take a bit of a risk and see what he could find deeper into Arctic King Bear and Arctic King Cobra territory. Chapter 375, Icy Blueness. Silas returned to the edge of the valley, having put the Mansa wand and the Basilisk King away. He felt good enough to try his luck. If there really was an Arctic Emperor Bear down there, he was really playing with fire. But he had long since become accustomed to risk. Just now, he had fought a few battles with straggler Arctic King Bears just to scout out their abilities and see if they were any different. And, indeed, he was right to do so, especially since he was lucky enough that he didn't kill any little princes or princesses this time. The abilities of the Arctic King Bear mirrored that of the Arctic King Cobra, but they functioned differently. It could be said that the Arctic King Bears were actually stronger overall. After these battles, Silas realized that the Arctic King Cobra race had likely been suppressed even when their emperor was here. This wasn't just because Silas couldn't use his beast totem on these polar bears either. Less than chilling claw greater than, less than Arctic King's polar domain greater than, and less than Arctic roar were their three main skills, pretty reflective of what the Arctic King cobras were capable of. The difference was that each one was far more dangerous. Less than chilling claw was a physical attack as well as an ether skill. As such, its base damage was amplified by the physical abilities of the bear rather than being just a pure mage-like skill. As such, on top of having special damage effects, they had a damage of over 300 to even 400 in many cases. And in Silas' estimates, that was only for common and bronze mastery at best. Less than Arctic King's polar domain came with a slowing effect. Technically, less than Arctic King's domain did as well, but it was more passive while less than Arctic King's polar domain was far more active. It almost felt like a gravity attack as well, though it wasn't quite that. Basically, less than Arctic King's polar domain came with a special effect while less than Arctic King's domain did not. Finally, both less than Arctic Howl and less than Arctic Roar shared similar enough names, but the effectiveness of the same skill in the hands of the polar bears was exponentially more potent. Silas' best guess was that it was because bears were innately capable of roaring and beating their chests. Cobras, on the other hand, were very much not. That made Silas wonder if he was actually limiting the power of his own less than Arctic Howl mutant skill by not putting much emphasis into the actual bellowing part of the skill. Only time would tell. The world of skills, runes, and genes was more complex than Silas had given him credit for, and every day he learned something new. Now that he was prepared, there was nothing to do but to take the risk. Silas slid down the edge of the valley, approaching from the more vulnerable territory of the Arctic King cobras. The space was large. He couldn't quite see to the edge of the valley, but the diameter must have been at least half a kilometer. He was making a bet that even if the Arctic King bears saw him, they wouldn't care to take action. As for the Arctic King cobras, he didn't fear them at all, especially not with his current strength. His feet touched earth, or rather, a dense pack of snow. It crunched beneath his feet, but felt surprisingly solid. With a step, he shot forward. The Arctic King cobras noticed his presence moments later and a hissing filled the air. But Silas directly ignored them, his eyes focused on the pool exuding a thick aura of ice poison. He not only felt a tingling danger coming from that direction, but he could also feel an opportunity. He knew there was a reason that these creatures called this place home. A level 7 Arctic King cobra suddenly appeared before him, but Silas caught its less than chilling cider with one hand and punched out with the other. He was completely immune to its ice poison, and a single fist was all it took to send it flying off into the distance. His beast totem appeared behind him as he was prepared for another rain of attacks, but to his surprise, the moment it appeared, they all froze and didn't move another inch forward. Silas' eyes narrowed, but his speed didn't drop. He practically glided across the snow as he approached the serene lake. The Arctic King cobras controlled a small part of the shore, and the closer Silas got, the more powerful they became until he started seeing several level 10s and 11s. However, not a single one was level 12 or beyond. Too weak. But it also didn't matter because none of them dared to attack him either. They practically opened up a path for him, looking toward him with what he thought was hope. These creatures were far more intelligent than normal animals. The Arctic Emperor Cobra could feel rage. Of course, even normal animals would attack when their offspring was killed, but Silas could feel a subtle but tangible difference. It wasn't just a fury fueled by an evolutionary necessity, but something far more human-like. And now, he could see that even clearer. Subconsciously, he could tell that these creatures were missing a leader. They were so desperate that after sensing that Silas was so much like them, they wanted him to take that role. By this point, the Arctic King bears were taking an almost lazy notice of what was happening. As Silas expected, they didn't seem to care to take action. Until he showed signs of entering the pool. At that moment, they all tensed as though they were shocked by his audacity. It seems that the missing Arctic Emperor bear might really be down there. Silas took a breath, but his steps didn't slow. He dove right into the waters, causing a rippling wave to spread out that even the strongest Arctic King cobras rushed out of the way of. The moment the water hit him, Silas felt his ether skin creaking and crunching almost immediately. It was slowly freezing, and very soon, it would penetrate into his very body. But he remained calm. He activated Rune Soul and Enchanted Scholar. Then, he organized the ice poison runes around him into a shield. Soon, his ether skin solidified and the pressure on him plummeted. He dove deeper and deeper into the clear waters until he laid eyes on it. There it was, a behemoth of a creature with beautiful white fur that exuded a slight icy blue light. It lay there at the bottom of everything, right next to a dungeon. Arctic Emperor Bear. Level 12. Suddenly, it opened its eyes. An icy blueness penetrated into Scylla's soul. Chapter 376 Change. Scylla's cool green gaze looked right back at it. The moment he saw that it, too, hadn't completed its evolution into the bronze grade, whatever worry he had vanished into the ether. Let's fight. He didn't say the words so clearly, but the bear understood them. Its maw opened wide and a furious roar bellowed out from its chest. Scylla could feel the difference immediately. This was a creature made to howl. Bang! The polar bear stomped a foot against the bottom of the icy lake and shot upward. It closed the distance in what felt like a single blink. Polar bears were exceptionally strong swimmers and had recorded swimming speeds far faster than any known human. Clearly, this mutated version of their lineage was no different. It swiped down, activating less than Arctic claw greater than. A beautiful, crystalline blue hue extended from each one of its claws, slamming down on Scylla's from above. Even without using less than Master Scouting greater than, Scylla's knew that this attack dealt almost 1,000 damage even without special damage factored in. This creature was a true powerhouse. Arctic Emperor Bear. Level 12. Physical 732. Greater than Strength 855. Greater than Constitution 903. Greater than Dexterity 570. Greater than Speed 600. Mental 833. Greater than Intelligence 1423. Greater than Wisdom 731. Greater than Charisma 345. Will 811. Its stats could overwhelm General Aileen in several facets despite being less than half the latter's level, and that without having completed its evolution, or getting the large boost that came from crossing the level 20 threshold. But Scylla's was already prepared. The moment the Arctic Emperor Bear was about to slash down, black scales had already erupted across his body. Name: Scylla's Grimblade. Species: Human. F. Affiliation: Grimblade Lineage. Class: Arctic Royal Fragmented. Profession: Vipermancer FFF+. Level 0. Physical 452. Greater than Strength 565. Greater than Constitution 648. Greater than Dexterity 291. Greater than Speed 297. Mental 708. Greater than Intelligence 629. Greater than Wisdom 942. Greater than Charisma 553. Will 1453. Luck 22. The claw swiped down with vicious momentum. The bear was enormous, and though smaller than the 20-meter length of the Arctic Emperor Cobra, it was wider and practically brimming with muscles. At 5 meters from the tip of its nose to its almost invisible tail, it was a truckload of power. Power that Scylla's was ready to handle. Roar. Bang. Scylla's unleashed a bellow, reaching down into the depths of his diaphragm with his intention and activating less than Arctic howl greater than. In the depths of this water where the ice poison ether was so thick and concentrated, the defensive skill was even more powerful than advertised. But the same was also true of the polar bear Emperor's claw. There was a strong rebounding force and Scylla's went flying upward. At the same time, the Arctic Emperor Bear froze for a moment beneath the new effects of his skill. A pillar of water broke the surface of the lake and Scylla found himself flailing a bit. He had still underestimated the power of the bear. Although he had had the intention to use its power to retreat, the result was still beyond his expectation. However, his expression didn't change in the slightest. His gaze flashed with a blue light and he poured his ether into his next skill. Less than Arctic King's domain greater than. His ice poison damage would be useless against the Arctic Emperor Bear, but he wasn't using this domain for the usual reasons. Just as he finished deploying the skill, the Arctic Emperor Bear rushed out of the water, its roar causing both the cobras and polar bears alike to shiver. The result is as expected. Silas wasn't talking about his domain just yet, but rather the reaction of the others. He originally planned to retreat if he met the Arctic Emperor Bear, but after seeing the reaction of the Arctic King Cobras, he changed his mind. There was a chance to use his tamer status here to his advantage. So he would take it. That was when his second plan kicked in. The bear might have been immune to ice poison, or more accurately, it was immune to ice poison of this skill's level. But now that Silas' domain had spread, all of the runes in the area were under his control. The root purpose of a domain skill was to cast some sort of control over a large area, and when that was taken to a logical extreme, it meant one very simple thing. The Arctic Emperor Bear could no longer cast ice poison skills, and at the same time, Silas' own ice poison skills became more powerful. On cue, the Arctic Emperor Bear tried to cast less than chilling claw again, only for the familiar blue sides that once extended from its fingers to barely manifest at all. By this point, Silas had already landed on the raging water's surface again. He shot forward, completely ignoring the claw that wouldn't form and unleashing a fist right into the bear's snout. The Arctic Emperor Bear's head shook in a hint of disorientation, but a second fist hit in quick succession, then a third. Its claw slammed down, hitting nothing but air and water. By then, Silas had already rounded to its side, unleashing another barrage of punches. It felt as though he was hitting a steel wall, but the depth of blazing wool in his eyes only seemed to grow. Having this sort of power in your hands, this sort of control. It was completely intoxicating. Right now, Silas' telekinesis could exhibit 981 points of strength. When he used basic etherflow, it was forced into an average with his base strength, but even then it was able to give him more than an additional 200 points of strength. On top of that, there was still his now FFF plus boxing comprehension for another addition plus 60% on top of that. However, that averaging of strength only happened when he attacked from a distance. When he attacked with his fists directly, it was a different matter entirely. This sort of power was something that even the Arctic Emperor Bear had simply never experienced before. Every punch reverberated through its body and the sound of cracking ribs and rended flesh echoed through the valley. Doom, 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 doom. Without its ice poison control, the bear lacked even the skill to keep up with Silas. Its body was being shredded apart piece by piece. It was then the situation changed. Chapter 377 Be Strong. The Arctic Emperor Bear stumbled back, fury lighting its blue marble eyes. It looked at Silas as though it wanted to tear him apart, but Silas didn't plan on having a staring contest with the creature. He already had every intention of ripping into it. It was then the Arctic Emperor Bear unleashed a howl. Crack. Silas felt his domain shatter. It quickly came back together under his control, but even then it was shaky. He could feel that the runes under his control had been forced into a tug-of-war battle and his eyes couldn't help but narrow. He dodged out of the way of a swinging claw, his mind swirling. This feeling, it's almost like when the Arctic Emperor Cobra resisted my beast totem somewhat. There was nothing in his beast totem's description that said it could be countered, but he had felt that the Arctic Emperor Cobra did so in part back then. Now, a bit of that same aura was coming from the Arctic Emperor Bear. It was like they weren't just emperors of their own little race, but rather emperors of the world. The laws of Earth wanted to obey them, and it was even suppressing Silas' control over the runes in the surroundings. Suddenly, the strength of the bear exploded and Silas found that he could no longer see its stats as though it had been obscured by something. This was the power of a beast that had broken the limits of the world. Or, more accurately, this was a quasi-limit breaker. This wasn't nearly as powerful as it would be on a true bronze beast. And yet, it was still able to suppress Silas' runed soul realm to this extent. Bang! The polar bear emperor swiped out with another claw, but this time, it was even larger than the first time Silas had seen it. What was most shocking was that it would have been even more powerful if Silas wasn't trying to rein in some control of the surrounding runes. Silas dodged backward, the indifference in his gaze becoming cold. The claws of the bear detached, becoming a ranged attack out of his expectation. Four scythes cut across the air, appearing before him in an instant. Less than Arctic howl greater than. Silas roared and the collision sent him flying back. The brief pause saved him from a fate of being shredded apart. The four sides froze in the air, and by then, Silas had already flown so far back that he almost landed on the shore of the Arctic king cobras. The Arctic emperor bear was already barreling across the waters. It looked as though it had grown a size, the blue aura around it growing more profound and potent. At the same time, there seemed to be a hay-formed bronze crown hanging over its head. The surrounding polar bears began to roar into the skies as though they were giving support to their emperor. At the same time, the Arctic king cobras began to respond in kind, their howls and hisses filling the valley. Silas felt his blood boiling for reasons he couldn't explain in a few words. In that moment, he seemed to have forgotten everything. He stamped down on the water once, causing a pillar to rise into the air. Silas charged out of the pillar of water, his hair being slicked back by the frosty liquids. However, he looked completely different. A pair of pauldrons floated before his fists and a pair of shin guards hovered in front of legs. Both were a deep crimson iron color and looked worn from battle. These were none other than pieces of General Aileen's armor, and each one was over 20 pounds in heft. The pauldrons alone were almost 40. And when Silas punched out, the Arctic Emperor bear would feel that. What did 981 points of strength feel like when it was backed by swinging ballista heavier than a sledgehammer? Well. Roar. Blood flew. Bang, bang, bang. Silas and the polar bear emperor clashed in the middle of the lake, claw meeting armor. The water churned and ice poison runes spiraled through the air. The frosty energy seemed to only grow thicker and more menacing, but the two were completely relentless. Silas unleashed a vicious kick. The shin guard flew through the air, a fiery green leg manifesting within it and slamming against the polar bear emperor's head. Blood was drawn, but a pauldron had already descended from the skies, shattering the bear's snout. Another pauldron cut up, smashing into its jaw and twisting its already deformed face. The bear unleashed less than Arctic roar and Silas' next combination of attacks was blown apart. A claw cut into Silas' chest, spiraling snowflakes cutting down from the skies above and shredding through his ether skin. It was a skill that Silas had never seen before. No, it's a gene talent. Silas realized this, but the indifference in his eyes was only belied by his fiery intent to battle. Feeling the blood flowing down his body and dripping into the waters below, he only felt a stronger will churning in his heart. Be strong. His telekinesis reached out, snatching the bits and pieces of armor out of the air. A blazing green fire poured into them and for a moment, such a strong force descended onto them it looked as though they might be forcefully molded into Silas's fists and legs. However, that was but an illusion. What wasn't an illusion, though, was their strength. Silas roared, activating less than Arctic howl again and forcefully shattering the descending current of snowflake blades. Bang, bang. Two quick punches shredded apart what was left of the polar bear emperor's bloody jaw. It lashed out again, but Silas was too far away. The sides of its less than chilling claw were too easily dodged. Less than chilling scythe greater than. Silas cast this for the first time in the battle. It manifested right before the bear emperor's open maw under his rune soul control. It couldn't dodge even if it wanted to, and it was too exhausted for its emperor domain to suppress Silas. Caught off guard, the attack pierced right into its open wound. Normally, even with its upgrade, this skill wouldn't be able to penetrate the constitution of the polar bear emperor. And, the ice poison would be too weak, causing it to ignore any special damage that was possible. But now, it froze in place, its body crackling as a continuous series of damage ripped through its veins. Silas huffed for breath, walking forward slowly as the 5 seconds of his skill played out. By the time he appeared before the Arctic Emperor bear, it was already trying to break free, but its feeble attempt was causing it to fall apart. The skill was capable of doing 750 total damage. After this long battle, the fact that the bear even had that much left to give was a miracle. Silas stood before it, looking up at its massive frame. He took a breath, looking the beast in the eye, and unleashed another punch. Bang! He felt the flesh deforming beneath his fist and the world fell into silence. Until the body of the Arctic Emperor bear collapsed, falling onto the surface of the lake. Silas took deep breaths, his chest heaving. And then the Arctic king cobras went wild, the roars piercing the skies. Chapter 378, Ilk. Silas took in deep breaths, his eyes flashing like lightning as he seemed prepared for another polar bear to leap at him at any time. But that wasn't what happened. Instead, the Arctic king bears all shrunk back, and the roars of the Arctic king cobras only grew louder. This situation was certainly unexpected, but Silas was able to quickly understand. The beasts of this world, at least after the summoning, didn't have any natural inclination toward or against humans. There were many times that Silas had noticed this. Even during beast tides, it was relatively easy to blend in. The only time Silas hadn't had such an opportunity was when he faced off against the snail, but that snail was also controlling the beasts in the surroundings to target humans, while there was also a team of humans dead set on stopping them from making their way through. The Arctic king cobras, though, immediately felt that Silas was one of their own when his beast totem appeared, and even the Arctic king bears had respected the battle between their emperor and Silas as though Silas was likewise the representative of the Arctic king cobras in their eyes. That was only further proven by the fact that the Arctic king cobras began to push forward, shoving the Arctic king bears back and occupying more of the shore for themselves. Soon, the situation in the valley had completely reversed, and it was entirely thanks to Silas. The cobras looked toward him with reverence in their eyes, and Silas realized then that there was more of a benefit to his vipermancer profession than he knew. He had used his beast totem before to easily subdue his blue cyclone horse. But that was done more casually than anything as he wasn't sure if it would work. But this time, his beast totem had clearly subdued these beasts without him having to take in any of them as contracts. Until now, Silas hadn't even thought about taking in another contract for several reasons. First, he couldn't sign an unlimited number. The limit seemed to be decided by his beast totem. The higher level it was, the more contracts he could sign. Of course, Silas was nowhere near that limit, to the point where he hadn't even bothered to check what that exact limit was. But the fact that he had such a limit made him realize that he couldn't just go around contracting any snake he came across. The Basilisk King was a legendary beast. Well, it had the potential of one. It seemed a shame to pair it up with an inferior creature for temporary gains. The second reason he never bothered was because the cost-to-reward ratio wasn't worth it. Right now, he could only fuse with one beast, and his were for the invincible path seemed to imply that he would be able to fuse with more than just one in the future. Still, he was limited to one for now, so taking in a second beast would mean committing to using it as a real battle pet. If the snake was strong enough, Silas wouldn't mind. But if he contracted a beast that was too weak, then he would end up wasting his time trying to keep it alive. That would defeat the entire purpose. Plus, his telekinesis and mind-splitting abilities already made him uniquely suited to fighting battles against multiple people. A weak beast wouldn't help him, it would only slow him down. This didn't even mention the fact that evolving these beasts was hard. It had taken him quite an ordeal just to get the Basilisk King to FFF, and he still had no idea how to help it level up. Now, it seemed that the Basilisk King's next evolution would require the strongest treasure he had ever seen to complete, the Basilisk skin armor. This was all to say that Silas had never seriously considered another contract. But now he realized that he didn't necessarily need to sign one to benefit from his vipermancer status. He didn't even need to ask these creatures, but they were already working for him. They secured the barrier around the lake and now Silas was almost certain that he wouldn't be bothered. Realizing this, Silas took a seat right in the middle of the waters, closing his eyes and taking a deep breath. First, he would recover. Then, he would enter the dungeon. Since it was so perfectly curated for him, how could he not? An odd sort of peace fell around the lake as though none of the beasts wanted to bother him. Frosty energy came into Silas' body and was expelled through his nostrils, a calming cycling forming in his body. He noticed after absorbing the intelligence bronze gene that it was possible to use ether to speed up his healing as well. Or more accurately, he could use his ether pathways to more efficiently guide ether to his cells and help to quicken the process by proxy. Now, he was testing that, but he felt that something was missing. Until he started to reflect on the insight absorbing the Constitution common gene had given him. When these two insights were layered onto one another, and the ice-poison affinity of his class came into the picture, Silas' wounds began to heal at a pace that was almost visible to the naked eye, though not quite. The pace was still slow, but for every 10 minutes that passed, there was clear improvement until he felt that he was back to 100%. I can definitely get better at this. If I can do this myself, I even bet there's a skill out there that can do the same more efficiently. but it's likely very rare. This is a high-level application of ether for sure. Silas wouldn't waste time practicing now, especially since he didn't even have any wounds to practice on. But soon, he'd likely have more than enough of a chance. He dove into the waters, closing in on the dungeon. Frostbane Sylph, FFF+. Level maximum, 20. Entry limit, 10. Recommended, mental 500, will 500. Description: the Sylphs are masters of the path of the Mancer, and their arrogance is their calling card. They proclaim themselves to be overlords, and those not of their ilk who dare to step onto their path will face their wrath. Chapter 379, Game. Sylphs. This was a first. It seemed that this dungeon was referring to a humanoid race. Did that make it different from the other dungeons that he had seen? The level requirements were also insane, especially considering the entry limit was 10. The recommended stats and levels factored in the number of entries for sure. Silas had confirmed this after the Basilisk King's Reign dungeon. If this dungeon only asked for one person, the recommended level would certainly be closer to 30. It was only because you could bring so much help that the requirement was only 20. Who are the Sylphs? The Sylphs are an E-grade race of beings that favor the path of the Mancer. They tend to be born with gene affinities that give them great control over the elements. E-grade race. Silas' gaze flickered. Name: Silas Grimblade. Species: human, F. He still didn't quite understand what his species was. All he knew was that whenever he ran into a stat or gene limit, it would be mentioned. His rudimentary understanding of it was that once one reached level 50, there would be a chance to evolve to a higher level. If one succeeded in becoming level 51, then you could become an E-grade existence. That said, an E-grade race sounded like a completely different thing. Did it mean that Sylphs were born level 51? That didn't seem to make much sense considering the dungeon only required him to be level 20. So it must refer to something else. Silas didn't really want to waste the genes on such a question, but in the end his curiosity got the best of him. I see, that's a bit troublesome. The overall grade of a race was decided by relative potential. An E-grade race was one that would have a relatively easier time of reaching the E-grade compared to those of an F-grade race. As such, on average, the number of E-grade existences among them would be substantially more than lower-level races, and by extension, they would have a better chance of striking at the D-grade and beyond as well. It wasn't a hard cap, but it could be depending on the situation. Unless one could break the mold of their race, you would be very likely to be stuck in said race's overall grade. By the same token, higher relative grade races also tended to have much greater strength at the same level compared to lesser relative grade races. Silas didn't need to ask the madness key to know his own relative grade because he had been staring at it ever since he came to his world. Species: human, F. It was right there in bold font and it wasn't going anywhere. Of course, it would change if he managed to become level 51. But unless he could change it while he was still in the F grade, whatever challenge he faced in crossing over into E grade would be especially tall. Silas stood in silence. At first, he was only planning to enter this dungeon for the sake of gaining whatever was on the inside in hopes that it would help to strengthen him. But staring at it now, he wanted to tear it apart. Silas took a step forward and vanished. No one knew that a single young man had entered a 10 entry limit level 20 dungeon on his own. There were too few people in the Arctic Circle, and even fewer would dare to even think about facing off against the horde of beasts around the lake. However, what everyone did notice was that Silas' merits had ticked up again. He was the only one on the list to begin with, and somehow he had already made the lead larger. Silas' vision spun. When he could finally see around him, even he couldn't help but be taken off guard. It was a quiet, somber environment. There was a bonfire ahead and there were around another dozen people around him facing off against an old man whose features were difficult to see because he stood behind the bonfire. However, the way the light of the fire flickered across his features made him look particularly sinister. As for the people around him, they didn't seem to be people at all. At least not in the normal human sense. They did look like humans, albeit a little bit too perfect, almost like models with an additional layer of Photoshop. What really made Silas feel odd was the fact their skin gave off a bluish glow. While their underlying skin tone was more normal, they were definitely giving off an unnatural light. Asriel. Suddenly, something clicked for Silas. He remembered the first time he met Asriel. He also felt that he had an odd blue tinge to him. But back then, Asriel had been so powerful that Silas had mistaken it for his ether or maybe even his aura. But now he was sure. Asriel should be a sylph. All at once, several gazes landed on Silas. The murderous intent was palpable. A human. It was hard for Silas to tell who had spoken. There wasn't much light outside of the bonfire, and because he had been using his visualization, there was a sudden distortion in his senses that originated from over a dozen separate locations at once. His mind almost felt like it was being ripped apart and he was forced to retract it. The pain didn't stop his mind from working quickly. The moment he felt such hostility, he activated madness. His vision hadn't even cleared before there was several roars of pain. At least half the sylphs fell to the ground, clutching their heads. Blood streamed down the noses and their bodies convulsed. By this point, Silas had recovered. His mind was far more robust than any of them had given him credit for, and the activation of madness had clearly rebuffed whatever secondary probes they had in mind. However, Silas didn't have the mind to care for this because he felt that he had well and truly screwed up this time. There wasn't just over a dozen people here, there were exactly 21. Or more accurately, there had been 20 until he showed up. Just enough to match 2 perfect entry limits. Had he just entered a team game by himself? Chapter 380, I Am. Silas slowly regained his bearings, his mind on full alert. There was always a risk of things going terribly wrong when you entered a dungeon with a higher entry limit requirement with fewer numbers. But for things to go this poorly was definitely unique. What Silas didn't know was that this situation was even worse than he knew. During a summoning, a world was in a unique state. There were many oddities that could occur, including events that intersected with already well-established worlds. Most of these odd occurrences could be described simply. The universe tended toward helping its children to evolve. It was a simple cadence of evolution. As such, the universe wasn't interested in protecting interests and drawing dividing lines. In fact, if it was up to the universe, every world would perfectly succeed in their summoning. This was all to say that when these odd occurrences happened, it was a method of the universe, or the system, rather, giving those of a lesser world an opportunity. The ceremony that Silas had just strolled into was one example of this. This was an event meant for sylphs and sylphs alone. He had no business appearing here. It could be said that everyone, including the elder lurking behind the bonfire, saw him as an enemy that should be directly killed. But by the same token, just like the Arctic Emperor Cobra, they were restricted by the laws of the system. Their pain wasn't just caused by Silas' madness comprehension, but the backlash of the system itself as well. They should have had an understanding of what it meant for a human to appear here, but they tried to overextend themselves nonetheless, and those that were foolish enough to do so had ended up facing some backlash. Such events were truly rare. It was no wonder that they would try and see if there was a loophole to take advantage of. But now that they had failed, the next time they tried to kill Silas, the result would be far worse. Silas' gaze flickered as he stood to his full height. He didn't hide his gaze, scanning everyone one by one, including the man standing behind the bonfire. There was no use in trying to hide his intentions, and since his visualization seemed impossible to use against these people, he could only rely on his eyes. Likewise, he didn't dare to try and scan their stats either. All he knew was that they must be beneath level 20. If he extrapolated the stat recommendations of the dungeon, then they all likely had around 500 mental stats and will as well. For now, until he thought of something better, this would be the best that he could do. Slowly, the sylphs around him also recovered from their mental backlash, some of them even swallowing elixirs directly to replenish themselves. Several more glares landed on Silas' body, but no one dared to act again. However, the oppression in the air would have likely suffocated anyone else. You are alone. The voice was gruff, aged and ancient. It sounded as though the man had been screaming at the top of his lungs for half a day and was somehow still willing himself to continue speaking now. It came from the elder behind the bonfire. Silas' eyes narrowed. Why can I understand their language so clearly? Interesting. It was an odd feeling. He knew they were speaking another language, but it still naturally translated when it reached his mind. He couldn't tell if this was a skill of the man himself, or if it was the system. Then again, he could understand the words of the other sylphs as well, so it was likely the system. I am. Scylla's words seemed to surprise most of them, including the man. But then there came the sinister gazes. They didn't even bother to hide their intent. After saying these words, the man fell into silence. It only took Scylla's a few seconds to realize something. They were waiting. There were likely more teams coming. Scylla's took a breath and made a decision. He turned and found a rock nearby. He took a seat on it and deployed his visualization into a tight 5-meter barrier around him. Then, he began to draw ice poison rune after ice poison rune. Soon, a dense frosty aura pervaded the area and thick mist was created. The mist quickly grew so thick that Scylla's couldn't even be seen within. This was most definitely a risk. For one, he was exposing his skill in runes for them all to see. This would certainly put them on guard. Second, he still wasn't sure if he was perfectly safe here, so what he was about to do came with an added level of danger. However, he had to do it. His mind was focused as he pulled out the polar bear emperor's corpse. As for his purpose, it was none other than the gene talent it had used. There was a reason Scylla's hadn't done this before. Extricate didn't work on gene talents. As far as he knew, the only way to get a gene talent was to rely on the system. Maybe if he upgraded Taboo Bond enough, but for now it was impossible. That meant that if he wanted a chance at a gene talent, he would have to waste basically all the genes in this corpse, and that was something he didn't even want to do. Especially since it wasn't even guaranteed that he would end up with the gene talent. His body had reached its bronze gene limit, so it was all or nothing. Either the system would give him a chance to unlock this gene talent, or he would be wasting maybe the most valuable gene resource he had ever gathered. If it was just that, it would be bad enough, but he was also taking another risk. Because he had reached his bronze gene limit, he had no space to gather the genes he would need to sacrifice to the gene talent in order to awaken it. So, he was also gambling on the fact that Extricate would be able to bypass his body and pass genes directly to his gene talent. Before, the gamble simply wasn't worth it. Too many things had to coincidentally go right. But now, he had no other choice. Attempt assimilation. Yes, no. Scylla's paused. Suddenly, an idea came to mind.